Hi, everyone. We've been in the unit called Decolonization and Nationalism, Unit 7. And so I just kind of want to how those ideas have played out in what we've discussed so far. So Gandhi uses nationalism to help get independence for India. Mao Zedong uses nationalism to bring China together under communism. We studied Ho Chi Minh last week and Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah. They all use nationalism to help their country either unite under one government or fight to get a foreign power out, fight for their independence. Okay. So, what we're going to talk about this week is how that plays out in South Africa. So, I just want to draw your attention to this map of Africa right here. It's kind of difficult to see the outline of the country, but I want you to look at these highlighted countries within the continent of Africa. So all these countries that are highlighted ended up gaining their independence in the 1960s. So by the end of the 1960s, there's 27 independent nations in Africa. Okay, so think of that time. When we discussed imperialism back in November, we learned that Europeans colonized throughout the world for raw materials and a market for their goods. So after World War II, many countries in Europe are destroyed and they need to rebuild. That's one of the reasons why India is able to gain their independence in 1947. That's right after World War II. Britain really is struggling. They don't really have a choice. Now that it's more into the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, that's really the height of the Cold War. So not only are we done with World War II and countries and economies are rebuilding, but now we're really just trying to prevent nuclear war. And so when these African nations begin to fight for their independence, a lot of European countries, they fight back a little bit, but ultimately these African nations are finally able to gain their independence. South Africa is a little bit different. It is an independent nation, but there are still many descendants of Europeans that still live there that are either the British or what you call the Boers. The Boers are the Dutch. And they're thriving in South Africa. They're rich, they're wealthy, they have no reason to leave. So they stay. And there's a policy in place in South Africa called apartheid, and that's what we're going to be learning about this week. So, what is apartheid? I would like you to click on this link and watch a short video that explains what apartheid is. If you click on this link and it does not work, it is on my YouTube channel, which I'll link on our Google Classroom, and you can click on that. But apartheid is an Afrikaans word meaning separateness or the state of being apart or literally aparthood. It was a system of racial segregation in South Africa enforced through legislation by the National Party, the governing party from 1948 to 1994. So apartheid, notice how it has the word apart in it. All it really means is that it was legal for the government to separate the races in South Africa. So Black South Africans had certain public restrooms and schools and places that they could live and go freely, and white South Africans had their own schools, their own transportation systems, which should sound very similar to what we have had in our country in the United States in the 1960s. However, this went on in South Africa for much longer. If you look at the dates, 1948, so after World War II, through 1994, which was pretty recently. So I want you to take a look at this chart and then make some observations and some questions. So how is power gained, maintained, and consolidated by the white minority under the system of apartheid in South Africa? Well, they did things such as having pass laws. So pass laws were designed to control the movement of Africans under apartheid. These laws evolved from regulations imposed by the Dutch and British in the 18th and 19th century slave economy of the Cape Colony. In the 19th century, the new pass laws were enacted for the purpose of ensuring a reliable supply of cheap, docile African labor for the gold and diamond mines. In 1952, the government enacted an even more rigid law that required all African males over the age of 16 to carry a reference book containing personal information and employment history. Africans often were compelled to violate the past laws to find work to support their families. So harassment, fines, and arrests under the past laws were a constant threat to many urban Africans. Protests against these humiliating laws fueled the anti-apartheid struggle. From the Defiance Campaign from 1952 to 1954, the massive women protests in Pretoria, 1956, to burning of passes at the police station in Sharpeville, where 69 protesters were massacred in 1960. In the 1970s and 1980s, many Africans found in violation of past laws were stripped of citizenship and deported to poverty-stricken rural homelands. By the time the increasingly expensive and ineffective past laws were repealed in 1986, they had led to more than 17 million arrests. So I want you to answer those questions. Another way that the white minority, because there was definitely way more Black South Africans than white South Africans. So another way that the white South Africans were able to maintain control of the government was by creating what was called Bantu stands or homelands. They were the cornerstone of the grand apartheid policy of the 1960s and 1970s, justified by the apartheid government as benevolent, separate development. The Bantu stands were created by the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1958, which abolished indirect representation of Blacks in Pretoria and divided Africans into 10 ethnically discrete groups, each assigned a traditional homeland, established on the territorial foundations imposed by the Land Act of 1913, which was amended in 1936. The homelands constituted only 13% of the land for approximately 75% of the population. The Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act of 1970 declared that all Africans were citizens of homelands rather than of South Africa itself, a step towards the government's ultimate goal of having no African citizens of South Africa. Between 1976 and 1981, 4 Bantu stands, Transiki, Venda, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, were declared independent by Pretoria, and 8 million Africans lost their South African citizenship. None of the homelands were recognized by any other country. Limiting African political rights to the homelands was wisely opposed, and in 1986, South African citizenship was restored to those people who were born outside the 4 independent homelands. After 1994, the homelands were reabsorbed into South Africa. So basically, all this is saying is that the government decided to, instead of letting the Black South Africans be citizens of South Africa, they made these Bantu stands and said that you're not South African, you're part of this Bantu stand, you're part of this homeland. And so what that did was it stripped the citizenship away from the Black South Africans. If you're not a citizen, then you can't vote. So that's really what it was coming down to. They were stripping them of any kind of voting rights that they could say they have if they were a citizen of South Africa. Well, no. You're not a citizen of South Africa. You're a citizen of this Bantu stand or this homeland that I've assigned you. That's what they were doing. Forced removals. So this is another way that the minority, the white South Africans, kept control over the much larger Black South African population. From 1960 to 1983, the apartheid government forcibly moved 3.5 million Black South Africans in one of the largest mass removals of people in modern history. There were several political and economic reasons for these removals. First, during the 1950s and 1960s, large-scale removals of Africans, Indians, and coloreds were carried out to implement the Group Areas Act, which maintained residential segregation throughout the country. More than 860,000 people were forced to move in order to divide and control racially separate communities at a time of growing organized resistance to apartheid in urban areas. The removals also worked to the economic detriment of Indian shopholders. Sophia Town in Johannesburg from 1955 to 1963 and District 6 in Cape Town were among the vibrant multiracial communities that were destroyed by government bulldozers when these areas were declared white. Blacks were forcibly removed to distant segregated townships, sometimes 19 miles from places of employment in the central cities. In Cape Town, many informal settlements were destroyed. In one incident, over 4 days in 1985, Africans resisted being moved from Crossroads to the new government-run Haisa Township further away. 18 people were killed and 230 were injured. Second, African farm laborers made up the largest number of forcibly removed people, mainly pushed out of their jobs by mechanization of agriculture. While this process has happened in many other countries, in South Africa, these rural residents were not permitted to move to towns to find new jobs. Instead, they were segregated into desperately poor and overcrowded rural areas where there usually were no job prospects. Third, removals were an essential tool of the apartheid government's Bantustan or homeland policy, aimed at stripping all Africans of any political rights as well as their citizenship in South Africa. Hundreds of thousands of Africans were moved to resettlement camps in the Bantustans with no services or jobs. The massive removals in the early 1960s to overcrowded, infertile places in the Eastern Cape, such as Dimbaza, Lingay, and Seda, were condemned internationally, which means that the international community did not agree with that. These were dumping grounds for Africans who were superfluous to the labor market, as a 1967 government circular called them. Ultimately, these people were to become the responsibility of independent Bantustans, so that the white regime would have no financial responsibility for the welfare of people there. Hundreds of thousands of other Africans were dispossessed of land and home where they had lived for generations in what the government called black spots in areas that the government had designed as part of white South Africa. Also, some entire townships were destroyed and their residents removed to just inside the borders of Bantustans, where they now faced long commutes to their jobs. By the 1980s, particular resistance to removals was widespread, and government plans to remove up to 2 million more people were never carried out. So what that was talking about was the government is literally taking land that belonged to Black South Africans, forcing them to live in places that aren't as nice so that they could have white areas, white neighborhoods, and then designating certain parts of the country to the Black South Africans. And it has lasting effects. So I want you guys to answer those questions.